So this is the first lecture. If you're over at CCS, it's Visual Narration Africa and the Diaspora. If you're over at Henry Ford, it is the history of African art. And I'm showing you this map because I hear sometimes the young peoples don't know geography. I kind of doubt that's true. Seems like you all do. But I would show a globe, but we're not looking at a globe. We're on a flat screen. So circle, and we see Africa. And the reason why I chose this particular map, as opposed to the maps that you may have seen on the walls in some of your schools, is because this one shows a scale which is fairly accurate as far as the size of Africa. So Africa is a huge continent. If you had one that was flat, a rectangle called the Mercator projection, that would tend to show the northern part of the globe as being very large. So it would show Russia as huge. It would show Greenland as big as Africa. And this is one of those cases where it's kind of a built-in kind of white supremacy or Eurocentrism to things that are very, very basic in society. The people that first made the Mercator projection, they were from Europe. So they wanted to emphasize the Northern Hemisphere. So that made places like South America, Australia, and Africa look much smaller. So I show this map because it gives you a more accurate idea of the tremendous size of Africa. So when you look at a map of Africa, you're seeing a bunch of country names, but most of these countries don't represent the ethnicities of the people that live in it. So it's not like what you would see in Europe, where if you go to Poland, there's going to be a whole lot of Polish people. Instead, these names are going to be the legacy of colonialism. So Africa is about 3 times the size of the US, including Alaska. So huge, in other words. And right now, there's about 1.1 billion people. I have the numbers from 2013, but it's only a bit more, like a couple 100 million more since then. And it's growing very quickly. It's growing faster than most parts of the world for a very specific reason. The population of Africa is pretty young. And as a result, there's going to be more people in following generations. Whereas in some of the other continents, the populations are much older, so they won't grow as fast. So the birth rate in Africa in general, but in individual countries as well, is going down just like the rest of the world. But because the population is so young, it is going to be much larger in the near future. So there'll be about 2.4 billion people by 2050. And these types of projections tend to be very, very accurate. And more than 4 billion people by 2100. And sometime around that time, it may be that there's more people in Africa than currently than there will be in Asia at the time. So Africa is one of the most diverse places on Earth. The only other comparison would be pre-Columbian North America, probably. There's about 1,000 different languages and a myriad of different cultures. So when you talk about Africa, it's not one single culture, not even close, but thousands of different cultures with varying connections, some of which will be connected to the West, as we'll see kind of early on in the class. According to Willett, there's more distinct peoples and cultures than any other continent. Like I said, the closest thing is pre-Columbian North America. So Africa, all of the places that you're looking at on the map were relatively independent until the 19th century. And the modern countries, as I said before, reflect more colonialism than ethnic groups. So if you look at this map, you can see, and this doesn't include all of the ethnic groups, but a lot of the major ones, including ones we're going to talk about, like the Mende and the Yoruba. And this gives you an idea of the peoples and cultures that are in these areas. And just like anywhere else, when you see people that are close together, they may share certain cultural characteristics or, kind of steal from each other. different types of beliefs and different type of artistic practices that we're going to see. So this is pre-colonial Africa, and it's before partition by Europeans, but it's kind of after the slave trade started to ramp up a bit. And some African countries in West and, well, kingdoms and empires in West and Central Africa were very early in the slave trade able to grow a bit. But over time, that did not happen. So some of these kingdoms were able to become powerful in the first 100 or 200 years of the slave trade. But when you're constantly trying to get people and capture people for the slave trade, it's not going to work over time. So European traders for slaves in the 15th century. And a lot of times, and this is one of these cases where we can kind of examine white supremacist assumptions, that if you live in a white supremacist society, and if you're listening to this, you most likely do, especially if you live in the United States, you may have about Africa and about slave trade. Like there's this kind of idea that you'll hear from people sometimes where they'll say, well, slavery wasn't so bad because it was Africans selling other Africans. And hopefully you can already see the problem with that. We saw a map on the previous slide where we saw all of these different cultures. And before the colonial period, no one in Africa would have an idea of what it means to be African. They would think of themselves as Ashanti, like we see here, or Yoruba, or even think of themselves as just related to their families or to their town or to their language. And you wouldn't have the idea of being African. So the people that did capture people and sold them into slavery were capturing other peoples. And they even used techniques over time through desperation that you may recognize because they're used by, for instance, modern police forces in the United States. So for instance, the Ashanti Empire took over some neighboring peoples who were, not very powerful compared to others. And they moved in, and then they made a bunch of laws, some of which were very arbitrary and weren't in line with the culture that they took over. And if you broke those laws, you could be arrested, and eventually you could be sold into slavery, whether it's to the West or to somewhere else. So you may recognize that is pretty similar to what you see in policing in Black neighborhoods today in the United States. So the other thing that I would mention is that the slave trade before slaves were sold to the West was much different. Slavery in the United States and the Americas in general, was what's called chattel slavery. That means that not only were you a slave, but the person that owned your body also owned all of your descendants. And there was no slavery anywhere else in the world at this time or later where that was the case. So it was literally, you didn't just own a person, you owned all of their descendants. And the way that Westerners began to think of race grew out of this kind of necessity to justify slavery and imperialism. So West African kingdoms, some of them were able to grow and gain wealth from the slave trade. But again, because there's only so many people that you can do this to, and the West had a particular advantage, it was a short-lived kind of growth. So what happened in the 19th century is Europeans began to directly colonize Africa. So even if they wanted to before the 19th century, they wouldn't have been able to. Africans were perfectly able to defend themselves with the types of weapons and military techniques that they had, and the Europeans wouldn't have been able to defeat them. Unlike the the Americas and the genocide that happened there, there were no diseases to help out the Europeans in subduing these areas. So what happened in the 19th century is that Europeans had developed very sophisticated weapons, such as heavy artillery that could be moved very quickly, machine guns, and slowly over time, they were able to colonize almost all of Africa. As you can see from this map, 1880, we have just a few kind of colonies starting. And then by the time we get to 1914, we have almost the entire continent is colonized. Abyssinia is modern day Ethiopia, and I would say they were semi-colonized in a way, but generally independent. But you can see that the British and the French were the biggest colonizers, but we'll also talk about the Belgians, who had probably the most brutal colonial state, genocidal state, I would say, of any colonial power ever in the history of the world. So we'll talk about them a little bit later on. So when you think of, and if this is a real life class, an in-person class, I'd usually ask the class, and usually people know the answer, what did the Europeans want? Why were they doing this? And the answer is labor and resources. So they wanted to get things like minerals. At first it would be gold, ivory, things like that. Later on, going into the 20th and 21st centuries, it would be things like oil, the world's most valuable commodity right now. And that's what they wanted. And to get some of the things, especially if you're talking about mining, like in South Africa, you're talking about mining diamonds and gold, they also wanted labor. And in some of the places, it was forced labor. In other places, it would be very low paid labor. So imperialism grew out of the growth of capitalism in Europe and in the United States as well, and the need to be able to reduce labor costs and reduce costs as far as materials. It's easier to take them than to pay for them. But also to get certain materials, as you know, capitalism was kind of trying to produce more and more products. So this changed everything. It also gave many Africans a sense of their shared identity, to think of themselves as Africans. And we'll see in a lot of the art, there'll be Pan-African styles and a sense of African nationalism. Sometimes it would be a local nationalism, but a lot of times it would be African nationalism would be an anti-imperial or decolonizing type of way of thinking. And most of the artists that we're going to look at will be involved with these types of ideas. So African independence, I should probably put those in quotes because it's a certain amount of independence. But not quite. So after World War II, many countries began to win their independence. Many Europeans wanted to give up some of their colonies, but others wanted to put these incredibly long timetables on it, and the Africans in different places had to take it into their own hands in uprisings and form their own governments. By the 1980s, most of Africa was independent. But the colonialism that we saw, where there was actually armies and governments that were occupying from Europe, Africa, was replaced by neo-colonialism. And during this time period in Africa, the United States became the primary neo-colonist. So to give you an example how neo-colonialism works, this example is from the 90s, but these sorts of things are still happening every day right now in Africa. And I'll tell you the story about Ken Saro-Wiwa, who lived in Nigeria, in the part of the country that is relatively rural. Nigeria towards the coast is super urban. The city of Lagos is a mega city with more than 20 million people in it. But in the country, that's where the oil fields are. And the oil is particularly valuable, especially to Europeans, because it's good for making diesel, which a lot of cars run on. And if you don't know, oil is the commodity that basically is the base of the world's economy, and in some ways the base of U.S. power. So Ken Saro-Wiwa lived in these areas, and he was organizing with others in his communities and in with neighboring communities to try to get more out of the oil trade for the people, prevent the environmental destruction, and prevent the labor exploitation that was going on. So you might, as you might imagine, some of the oil companies like Shell did not consider Wiwa to be someone they wanted in the picture. So they took their private army and kidnapped him, and in with collaboration with some in the Nigerian government, Saro-Wiwa was arrested along with 6 other people, I'm sorry. And they were tried in a kangaroo court. So if you're not aware, a kangaroo court is a court where before the trial starts, they know already that you're going to be guilty. And they found them guilty and hung all of them. And this is kind of like, in some ways, less extreme than a lot of what you see in neo-imperialism, and sometimes more extreme because it's not necessarily always violence. Things like blood diamonds in Angola and Sierra Leone, the trade in these diamonds fueled some of the civil wars. And again, I should put up the air quotes for civil wars, because generally imperial powers want this type of instability, not too much, but a certain amount of instability, so that they can prevent local governments from doing more for their own people. And we're going to see how that relates to the cultures and the arts and art education we're going to see. And especially as we go along, I'll concentrate on the role of the United States as the primary imperial power working in Africa. So sometimes when people think of Africa, outside of Africa, in the West and in some other places, because Western culture has kind of made its way everywhere, there are some mythologies that people have. The first one, and hopefully you don't have this, but Africa is not mostly jungle. Only 10% of it is tropical rainforest. And tropical rainforest is not a good place for humans to be. The only people that live in tropical rainforests are people that have been driven there, hunter-gatherers, from a long time ago, either from agriculturalists that were African people a long time ago, imperialists or neo-imperialists. And because there's a lot of resources that are useful for capital in some of these rainforests, some of these people's lives are in danger, but it's not somewhere where someone would choose to live. It's better to live in areas that are, grasslands or something along those lines than living in the forest. So it's not mostly jungle, and we're not going to talk about any forest cultures like that in our class at all. The Sahara, sometimes it's thought of as that there's just a completely different world south of the Sahara and north of the Sahara. And there's a little bit of truth there being differences, but there's also going to be connections. And we'll talk about some of the connections between, for instance, ancient Egypt and how some of these ideas might have made their way into other places in Africa, and then vice versa. So most of the desert was once green until about 6,000 BCE. And some of the earliest works we're going to look at are going to be in what is now a serious desert, like complete wilderness where no one could possibly live, but we're going to see paintings and other works of art inside of those areas. So Berbers was just actually an offensive name. It comes from barbarians, and it's not what any of the groups that live that cross the Sahara call themselves. The Tuareg is a good example of the groups in those areas. And Muslims connect North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa after the desert expands. And so we're going to see some of those connections and some of the cultures we look at, especially the ones that are along the Sahara. So we'll see the influence of Islam and Islamic art, especially, but also other cultural influences. So this is something that we're going to do in our next discussion, whether you do it in the discussion board or you do it in a Zoom call. this is what we'll talk about. So I'll skip this slide for now. So the history of African art history, and what I'm talking about is the way that the West talked about African art history. And one of the ways that the early European thinkers thought of African art history was that it was primitive. So African art history, the culture, people, politics of Africa was seen entirely in an imperialist lens, which was white supremacist. So imperial powers generally throughout history want to justify their imperialism. They never want to say, hey, we're just going to steal all your stuff and we don't care if you live or die. Instead, they want to look and say that, oh, these people, they were living this simple life and it was really difficult and we brought them technology, or we brought them progress, or we brought them the enlightenment of great European art or something like that. And almost every imperial power in the world thought of themselves in that way. We'll see a notable exception when we look at Leopold's Belgian Congo a little bit later on. But generally, the types of ideas that Westerners, Europeans, and the people of the United States, especially later on, thought of with Africa was based in this idea to justify imperialism and the slave trade. So one of the ideas are, and I have an arrow going to Darwin, but it's not his fault because he didn't believe this at all. But people took Darwin's ideas, the idea of natural selection, and a word which he wished later on he wouldn't, a phrase he wished later on he wouldn't have used, the survival of the fittest, because it doesn't explain how evolution works. And they took this and integrated it with developing white supremacy imperialist views, and came up with this idea of social Darwinism. So this is an example of what's called, and I'm putting the quotes up again, scientific racism. It's not scientific at all, but it's a way to put the sheen of science onto these white supremacist and imperialist views. So social Darwinism kind of perverted the ideas of Darwin, who again didn't believe this stuff, where they said, oh, survival of the fittest means that the peoples around the world who were able to conquer the most, who had the best military technology, were the ones that were the best. Survival of the fittest means best. Didn't mean that at all, and that's not how evolution works. But that's the way they looked at it. And they looked at the world as being white people on the top, whether it's Europeans or people of European descent in the United States or Australia, as being at the top. And then other peoples, since they had been conquered, as being below. So Asians and Africans as being below this. And they would say, okay, Asians and Africans, they were less fit and Europeans were more fit based on this. But again, this was just a way to justify the growing imperialism from the West. And that showed up in the way that Western people and scholars who talked about African art history talked about it, and also how they talked about the influence of African art, which was huge, on modernist art in the West. So one example is Boaz's Primitive Art, where he's talking about the influence of Africa and Asia as well on modern and modernist artists, like going from Gauguin to Picasso. And then Goldwater's Primitivism in Modern Art in 1937, where he's talking more about modernists like Picasso and Matisse. So Picasso is one of those examples of people whose art changed because of their exposure to African art. What came along with colonialism in the late 19th century is people started to have access to many more African cultures, and many pieces were stolen and brought to the West. And people like Picasso, they would collect these things. And Picasso recognized right away some of the sophisticated things that were going on formally with the art. He didn't understand the meaning of the art, and that's what we're really going to talk about. But he did understand that the abstraction that you see in Western art works because of context. So it's kind of Picasso had kind of a shallow view of it, but he took those ideas and put them into his art. And you can see with this famous painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, was generally considered to be the first modernist painting that kind of destroyed the old way, the old Renaissance way of thinking. And he integrated mass, and he painted these later on. We have x-rays, and these were added at the very end. He saw a relationship between some of the African mass that he collected and some of the things that he connected from the ancient Iberians, meaning the people, his ancient ancestors. And he was trying to create something new from the ancient. And Picasso, not exactly the best person, horrible in a lot of ways. If you asked him sometimes if he was influenced by African art, he would say, no, I thought of this before that. And then other times he would say, of course. It's would be impossible to say he wasn't influenced. We have photographs of him in front of the African art, and we have x-rays to show the changes in his art. So he was exposed to, and this is very good to know because it kind of it can help you understand how white supremacy worked in culture and in museums specifically. Picasso saw the African art pieces in the Musée d'Ethnographie, meaning the ethnographic museum. So that would be the same kind of museum that you would see just like folk culture from all around the world. But also you would see things like Neanderthals and things like that. And even some Africans were brought to Europe and displayed as if they were in these dioramas that they make in these types of museums. So the fact that they weren't put in art museums shows that they didn't see these things as art, and they had no idea what they meant. We're going to talk about the things they meant, but they saw it as craft and art that had no philosophy or spirituality or any ideas behind it, and not art. And that was out of ignorance, but it also comes from a white supremacist view of the world. So the way that Europeans and Americans as well, like Goldwater, approached African art was subjective and in the context of imperialism and white supremacy. And, you know, a lot of these people who are talking about these things and expressing these white supremacist views or imperialist views wouldn't know that they're doing so. And that's important that those of you who are students to think of. If you grew up in the United States, if you grew up in Europe, you grew up with a bunch of assumptions about the world that are white supremacist. And hopefully one of the valuable things that you can get out of this class is discover those things in your own thinking and being able to be aware of them and hopefully dispel them and learn to view things in a more objective way. So if we move forward to contemporary ideas about African art, instead of saying, oh, look at this stuff and let's compare it to Western art, there were context studies. So in other words, if you found a work of art, you talked to people, you asked them what they meant. You tried to understand their culture, their religion, their philosophies. And the idea was to try to be more scientific in a 20th and 21st century way, to be more objective. But of course, this is impossible. And this textbook is a really good example. All of the writers are white, and there are points in this book where their whiteness comes out very clearly. And I can give you an example by reading a couple of excerpts from the beginning of the book. So many of the ideas here are very interesting. So I'll read you some of the quotes from the preface to the book. So this is a preface in a textbook is basically trying to set you up for what does the book want to do and where did this stuff come from, you know, kind of intentions and techniques and such. So it starts out in a kind of interesting way in the first edition of this book. So not the one we're looking at, but the original preface. And the first words are, since its inception last century, the field of African art studies has been vexed by the problem of cross-cultural translation. So there's a couple of things that are going on and that you often still see in modern society with, especially coming from the good, and I put the quotes up, totally not racist liberal types that you see in the United States. And the first thing is the inception of African art studies in the last century. In other words, saying that the Africans and the art that they made before and what they had to say about it was not studies. And it only happened with exposure to the West. That's literally what they're saying. So obviously a white supremacist view and saying we as Westerners can define African art. The Africans themselves can't define it. So the other thing that's interesting is when they talk about cross-cultural translation. And the problem that with that is it takes this imperialist white supremacist history that we talked about of African art history and history any type that was written about Africa from the West, and it subtracts the white supremacy, the racism, the imperialism from it. It says, oh no, it's cross-cultural translation, we just don't understand. And that's a big problem because that's basically saying if those of you that are Black, hopefully you haven't heard this before, but if someone says to you, a white person says, I don't see color, or I don't care if you're Black, white, or purple. For some reason, they're always obsessed with purple people, or something along those lines. And that's basically what they're saying here. They're saying, oh, it's just I don't understand, instead of putting it in context, an objective context of white supremacy and imperialism. So as it goes on, it also says some interesting things. And again, this is in the first edition. It says, in a bold and innovative manner, the authors of this textbook have taken a major step forward toward the goal of fashioning a new lens, one which appreciates the methodology of the finest traditions in Western art history, which also examines the need to critically examine, modify, and expand. So what they're doing here is they're saying, again, it's a little softer than the first statement, but it's saying we're the ones that are making the steps. These three white people that are listed right here, Vasona, Pointer, and Cole. And that's where the innovation is coming from. And that fits right in with this. Remember I said imperialists never want to say that they're going into an area to steal all your resources or exploit your labor or eliminate you from the area so they can take your stuff more easily. Instead, they're going to say they're trying to help you. And that idea of moving things forward, of being innovative, and that's inherent to Western culture, and the rest of the world is primitive or going in circles. Embedded in what they're saying here is that type of viewpoint. It's softer, but it's the same viewpoint. So they're looking at African art history as coming from themselves. So in other words, a very self-centered view. And that is inherent to what race scholars call nowadays whiteness. And if you're white and you're growing up in the United States or Europe, this is something that unless you make yourself aware of it, it's just there inside of your head. So hopefully, again, this class will help you to make yourself aware of when you do that and kind of break up some of those ideas. So that was the first edition, and I'm guessing that they got some pushback from African art scholars, most likely, and historians. And with the second edition, they're singing a different tune. It starts with, the book you're reading is the gift of hundreds of people in Africa and other continents who have shared their art, their images, and their expertise with the authors. So in other words, instead of locating this art history in themselves, and they're the ones that are pushing it forward, instead they're looking and they're saying, we are getting this from Africans, and it wouldn't happen without their kindness. They say a gift of giving us this knowledge and access to their ideas. So even in the second edition came out in 2007, the previous one was in the mid-90s. So even in that short period of time, we see a big change. And hopefully in this class, if you're listening, you can have some changes too in the way that you look at Africa and look at race. So these are some general ideas in African art, and we're going to see so many ideas. So it's just ones that you will see in some cultures, but not in all, and some of them won't have, we'll only have a few of these ideas. It all depends. But there's some things that'll come up, and it'll be useful to kind of introduce them here. And we'll see more specifics as we go along with the cultures as we study them and the art as we study it. So one thing, and you see this all around the world, is art that has to do with the spirit world, with ancestors and with gods. And most cultures, when they make art, that's the types of things that they're making art for. There's also the idea of art being used to gather, control, defend against power. And again, that's very common around the world. You see it if any of you grew up Catholic, you can see it in a lot of the Catholic art that we see, the art of saints and those sorts of things where people are trying to get intercessions from them. So a very common thing to have pieces to control and use power. So art in context, some of the art will be used in masquerades, like the thing that we looked at, the mask we looked at the first day. And ritual, again, that's actually, the mask is used in a ritual. And then we'll see things that are in shrines. So those are made for display, and they still have meaning, but more like you would see like in museums in the West. So the idea is right actions and right thoughts for a lot of these. So some of these are didactic, meaning the pieces are teaching people right ideas, actions, and thoughts. But also sometimes they can believe to have the power to kind of imbue right actions and thoughts. And we'll see those in detail as we go along. Many of the pieces, especially in West and Central Africa, not so much in other parts of Africa, pieces are really stylized. And many of you on the first day recognize the African piece, and that might have been part of it because of the abstraction and stylization, along with one piece being black and the other one being white, obviously. But stylization is something you see in West African art and what a lot of Europeans were impressed by. So you see more of that being associated with African art than all the styles we're going to look at, but with a philosophical background. So it's not just stylization to look cool, but they look cool. That's kind of important. Everything's got to have beauty and balance. But also they have meaning. So in the case of Chiminda Ilunga, he's a Chakwe kind of like culture hero. And we're going to see a lot of those. He's spelled in different ways, depending. He is believed to be this ancient hunter that gave people the gift of hunting. And men love to hunt in this culture as well. So Chiminda Ilunga is thought to be a hero. And he's shown as being powerful. He has these exaggerated hands and feet that gives him power and stability. His head is kind of larger than his body, showing kind of like the wisdom, intelligence, and knowledge. And we'll see a lot of things like this, but even more specific as we get into individual cultures. Because the meanings tend to be, kind of develop over time and be quite complex. So realistic images exist alongside those with purified, amplified, and reassembled natural clues. So a lot of different ways of communicating messages. We will see some naturalism, especially in the more ancient cultures. But as time goes along, Africans tend to be more interested in abstraction and stylization that's thought to be more sophisticated than naturalism in a lot of cultures. And one thing, actually I should go back. One thing that's kind of important is that when you look at African art, it's coming from informants. Sometimes, as the scholars mentioned here, it's coming from African scholars themselves, but the scholars often have to go into cultures that aren't their own, that are African ones, and study it themselves. So a lot of times these pieces are being used in initiation ceremonies and societies, some of which are secret societies. And in a lot of, especially in West Africa, there's a lot of secret societies that are kind of the way that culture runs. So there's women's societies and men's societies. And if you're in a certain trade, there'll be a society. And a lot of times they'll kind of think of themselves, they're doing really practical things, but they also think of themselves as having certain spiritual powers that they can gain as they move upwards. And some of these things and ideas are thought to be secret, and to reveal the meaning of, say, a piece or a type of writing would be possibly dangerous, and you would be allowing someone to gather power that they could use against you. So if you rely on informants, some informants might, say, okay, I'm going to tell a scholar the truth. Other ones might intentionally lie because they don't think it's a good idea for outsiders to know this kind of stuff. So that's a difficulty that if someone's studying African art, and even if you're in the culture yourself, you may not know what people in the secret societies know. The artists themselves may not know what the art means, and only the person who commissioned it or the group that commissioned it would know what it means. Then additionally, the meanings will change throughout time. So the same form will have a meaning to contemporary people, to people 100 years ago. It doesn't have the same meaning. So that makes studying these arts very difficult. And it's something to be aware of as we go along in the class. So the outline of this class, I'll start with from the Nile to the Niger. There's a country that's a Francophone country called Niger, and it's the same word, but usually people do the region. That's what I'm talking about here in Niger, which is much bigger than the country of Niger. They anglicize it. So what I'm going to do throughout the class, not to confuse you, hopefully. And we'll talk about ancient Egypt in there, and we'll talk about Ethiopia. We'll talk about Christianity and Islam. And the reason why I start with those things is because I think most people have a little bit more familiarity with Egypt and possibly with Christianity or Islam and some of those ideas. So that's a good place to start. Because when you get to West Africa, it's going to be many different ways of thinking that are a lot different than what you might be used to. And it's a little bit more difficult to understand. So hopefully with this base and the relationships that we see with the ancient Egypt and Western Africa, that will provide a bridge for us to be able to understand some of these cultures. And we'll move on to Central Africa and Eastern and Southern Africa together. I'll kind of explain why when we get there. And then we'll end with the diaspora. And what the diaspora means is people of African descent around the world. And most of the people, of course, there's recent immigrants to places around the world, but mostly we're talking about the slave trade, people that did not willingly go to where they are. So the diaspora basically means Black people around the world. So we'll talk about that when we talk about contemporary art. And we're going to talk about contemporary art in each of these sections regionally. But with this, we'll talk about contemporary art in the UK from Black people and from the United States.